and George Pickering at Supermarines, which I did. And I was there from November 1939 until late in 1940, when I was privileged to be appointed the chief test pilot at Castle Bromwich. And from then on, we flew 37,000 sorties, and I suppose almost every mark of Spitfire that was produced. Both the Hurricane and the Spitfire were revolutionary in the sense that we were switching to low-wing monoplanes as opposed to biplanes. And where the Supermarine Spitfire was so different from the Hurricane was in the construction of the wing, which was a very thin wing, constructed in such a manner that the torsion loads were taken by the design of the wing spar, and at one time it was thought that it would be impossible to put this into mass production. But as the history will show, that it was produced in very large numbers and very satisfactorily. When a designer of genius like R.J. Mitchell dies, the effect on a firm would normally have been calamitous. But Mitchell, either by design or good luck, had gathered around him a small team of very highly qualified, dedicated technicians who were not only able to create the masterpiece that Mitchell himself had designed, but went way beyond any conception that R.J. would have had of the Spitfire in its future development right until the end of the war. I can understand the modern pilot looking askance at the Spitfire, because it's rather like someone asking me in 1939, would I like to take a Sopwith Camel up against an ME-109? And of course, I can tell you my answer would have been unprintable. No, the Spitfire was designed for the war as we anticipated it would be. It was the battle that we had to fight tomorrow that the aircraft was designed for, and frankly, it was the most outstanding aircraft, as you know, of the whole war. And that takes in the Americans, the Germans, and the rest of the British.
I suppose the Spitfire is the legendary fighter aeroplane. What is perhaps surprising is it's absolutely justifiable, absolutely delightful aeroplane. Difficult to quantify its value as a fighter, but certainly as an enjoyable aeroplane to fly, it's absolutely tremendous.
Well, it sounds silly to say it now, but I reckon they ought to have trained blokes on Spitfires and let them graduate onto flying Tiger Moths, because to fly a Tiger Moth you've got to be quite a skilled bloke, you know, and especially flying in formation or something like that. But Spitfires were very easy to handle, a bit skittish at times, you know, but you got your own peculiar one, and it's one of those things that you just got used to, you know. It was a very easy aeroplane to fly.
It's really a matter of the harmonisation of the controls and the general right feeling of the whole aeroplane. By harmonisation of controls, I mean it is very, very light on the elevator. So in terms of demanding G, you can actually, largely speaking, fly a Spitfire with one finger. And you get the same control feel about all three axes, which is not the case with a number of other aeroplanes. It's just wonderfully agile. It really, once it's airborne, doesn't need you. It's not particularly pleasant at times, takeoff and landing, simply because the undercarriage arrangement makes it unstable on the ground. But those things aside, it is just so responsive as to be absolutely beautiful. A Spitfire or a Hurricane always stinks of petrol all the time, a little bit of oil mixed in. In the summer, it is just insufferably hot, and in the winter, it is insufferably cold. There are no real aids to anything whatsoever. I mean, both the early Spitfire and all marks of Hurricane totally unpressurized, so if you don't want to freeze, then you wear sheepskin, whatever. There's no room in the cockpits. I mean, I'm relatively slightly built, and it is extremely cramped. So, yeah, they've got an atmosphere, but the atmosphere is that it's an actual nightmare cockpit to go to war in. But if you don't have to go to war, then it's wonderful, of course.
It would probably be impossible to find a pilot who, having flown a Spitfire, has not fallen completely in love with the aircraft. What is it about the Spitfire that makes it so special? Such a pilot's aeroplane? Paul Day of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight explains the basis of the Spitfire.
Well, that is a Mark II Spitfire, which just happens also to be the only flying survivor of the Battle of Britain, complete with bullet holes. It's the very basic early Spitfire. It's Merlin engined, around about 1,100 horsepower. It should have a three-bladed propeller, but we simply don't have one at the moment, so it's flying with a four-bladed propeller. You can see from the leading edge of the wing where the gun patches are that it was armed with 4 machine guns, 303s in each wing. And if we want to move around just a little bit and take a look at the tail, well, you can see we have a relatively small rudder, so that its left-right effect, if you like, is not going to be particularly great. So where for real they would never have had to deal with crosswind, because you always operated from grass field and therefore you could always take off and land into wind. Nowadays, where we have to operate hard runways most of the time, you then buy whichever crosswind applies to that runway. So that is not going to be particularly effective counter-crosswind, which is why we have relatively low limits for it. If we now look at the elevator section, which is here, then you can see that it is early Spitfire. Only the Mark I and the Mark II were like that, because eventually, because this had poor handling characteristics in high-speed turns, it was eventually modified to extend the horn balance way out across the full section of the tailplane. So it says basically it's early Spitfire, it's going to be a handful in a crosswind. To explain to you why the Spitfire is a bit of a handful on the ground, whether or not you're dealing with crosswind, the first thing to appreciate is that the main wheels are extremely close together. That clearly is going to be a destabilizing influence. What is perhaps additional and not maybe apparent, we can see it's an early Spitfire because on the left wing you've got the circular oil cooler, on the right wing you've got the box-shaped radiator. It's probably not apparent, but with the wheels down, the airflow is so disrupted that there is very, very little, if any, cooling, either of the oil cooler or of the radiator. So consequently, average English summer day, after engine start, if it isn't airborne inside 10 minutes, it boils. If it boils, you abort the display. And I'm sure it had its operational consequences back in 1940. So basic Spitfire, Battle of Britain, not particularly powerful, not particularly heavily armed, but obviously it won. It must be effective.
There were a number of minor faults with the Spitfire in its early guises, but from the outset it was a very well-designed aircraft. That, at any rate, is the view of the famous 30s aviator who was one of Supermarine's most important and experienced test pilots, Alex Henshaw.
When R.J. Mitchell designed that Spitfire, he designed it for 1,000 horsepower. He had no idea of the potentiality of the engine going up to over double that, and it was designed for a weight, shall we say, around about 5,000 pounds. It was designed for a particular type of armament, a certain weight, and for all that specification, we know that the ailerons could have been improved upon because they were fabric as opposed to being metal. And had they had metal ailerons when the first aircraft was flown, and had it had a constant speed air screw when the first aircraft was flown, you'd say, well, this aircraft is perfect. They always said that the Spitfire would never go into mass production. For one thing, it was too complicated. Well, now what Mitchell had done, he had extruded spars, but the problems with a very thin wing is taking, as you know, the torsion stresses. Well, the way Mitchell overcame this was a 14-gauge Dural nose that came over completely over, that became attached and was an integral part of the spar. Well, that gave the strength to the wing, but I think where Mitchell was very shrewd, he twisted the wing in manufacture. It was positive 2.5 degrees at the centre section, running out, tapering out to minus half a degree at the tip. And I've got a feeling it gave a beautiful flow, coupled with a thin wing, that gave an uninterrupted flow over the empennage. And so, I mean, when you land a Spitfire on an aircraft carrier, it must be one of the easiest aircraft, except it was blind, that you could possibly have, because you've got an enormous high angle of attack if you wanted it, depending on the amount of power.
Safely.
And still with lateral control, and no fear that the bloody thing's going to bite your hand off. The only time I was ever let down by a Spitfire, and it was my fault, was when we had these skew gear failures. And I had this skew gear failure over the Black Country, and I was at 800 feet, and it was a question, should I bail out or not? And your mind is working so rapidly that you think, Christ, I'm low. There's all these schools and factories and houses. You'll stay with the aircraft. Where the hell can you land? There was nowhere to land. You had just canals and electric cables and factories and terraced houses. And the only place I could see was a few garden plots at the back of these terraced houses. And then there was a canal bank further on. I thought, well, that'll stop me if nothing else does. And I thought, and there was a school a little bit to the right, another fact. I thought, I've got to hit this cabbage patch running at the back of these terraced houses. And in those days, I think I could put a Spitfire down pretty well where I aimed at it. And I came in, and I was determined to get onto this patch of Brussels or whatever it was, next to a garden shed, and hope the garden shed took some of the impact. And the moment I just turned, my starboard wing bit my head off. And I'd forgotten when I landed at Cosford, the bloody camera door had been left, and then she snaked onto the ground a bit. I thought, well, the camera door's under. And I forgot to tell the mechanic to fasten the camera door. And that nearly cost me my life, because when I came in, the starboard wing stalled, it touched an oak tree, that wing went off, I swung into the house, left the prop on the kitchen table, what was left of it. The other wing came up on the other side. I ploughed through these garden sheds and cabbages and hit something fairly solid, and it spun round and took half the fuselage away. And there I was with a little bit of the fuselage left and sitting there thinking, well, you know.
Lucky one.
Lucky.
Although the Spitfire was not the strongest ever aircraft, the Hurricane could absorb more punishment, it certainly inspired faith in its pilots.
But if you want real faith in a Spitfire, for example, there was, one of my chaps was set on fire at about 25,000 feet and was trying to bail out, but he couldn't get the hood open because it had been hit as well and jammed. And he'd got no elevator control at all. and 6 just absolutely, everything shot away. And it started coming down, but as it gained speed, it became tail heavy, as aircraft did, and it pulled up again until it stalled, and then the nose dropped out again, and off he started on the great downward path again. And the same thing happened, and he was just dead lucky, because when he reached the ground, it was just the time that it was pulling out again, and he went straight into a wood, and the wings came off, and that slowed him up a bit. The engine went on its own, and he finished up crawling out underneath the dashboard, underneath the instrument panel, and all he got was his boots were scorched by the fire, but of course there was no through draft because he hadn't been able to open the hood. So all it had done was scorch his boots.
Pilots loved the Spitfire not for any one single reason, but because it was and is such a delight to fly.
A beautiful little aeroplane, lovely to handle. I wish I could afford to keep one now. It'd be great fun. Yes, it's a sheer delight, actually, to fly, because it was, you thought what you wanted to do and it did it. You didn't have to even tell it. It just did it for you.
Tony Bianchi, one of the small band of current pilots, is also convinced of the Spitfire's virtues, especially in the early Marks.
The Mark 1 through to the Mark 5 are definitely nicer airplanes to fly. They're lighter, they're much better balanced. They have generally a better low-speed performance. I mean, the only indicator I can give you is that the Mark 1 was the first aeroplane I ever flew, and I never flew another Mark until about 5 years later, and that was a Mark 9, and I was disappointed when I flew the Mark 9. It was evident that it was much heavier and much more not so well balanced in pitch. It didn't have anywhere near the takeoff or climb performance that the Mark 1 had. It was much heavier on the ailerons, and as an aerobatic aeroplane, as what you would use them for today as a fun aeroplane, there was just no comparison at all. And I've never changed my mind in the last 18 years of flying them. This is a Mark 16, and there are some differences in which are external, but internal, cockpit-wise, virtually the same. All the controls are the same as a Mark 1. There are a few extra controls, such as an air filter, and the throttle is slightly different, but in the main, basically the cockpit's the same. Right, starting from the left-hand side, you've got the brake pressure gauge, which is an air pressure system, pneumatic system, and it gives you the pressure distributed to each brake unit. You've got the elevator trim, which is quite a clear and concise, easy to see, and a wheel on the side, which gives you an indication of what the trim position is, elevator trim. You've got an undercarriage indicator, which shows you whether undercarriage is up or down. Oxygen regulator. You've got the flap lever, which is it's a pneumatic flap system, and it's simply up and down. With rather a nice sort of period lever on it. Moving around on the actual flight panel itself, it's got the airspeed indicator in knots, standard British sensitive altimeter, artificial horizon. You've got a directional gyro or compass. You have a climb and descent indicator, and you've got a turn and slip indicator, a standard sort of instrument, and it's a standard kind of panel that you would expect to find in any other aircraft of that sort of period. Moving over on the right hand side, you've got the engine rev counter. You've got a boost gauge, which gives you an indication of how much boost the supercharger is providing to the engine. You've got an oil temperature gauge, you've got a radiator temperature gauge, and an oil pressure gauge. Fuel tank contents, which gives you a reading on both fuel tanks, which are in front of the instrument panel. Two tanks, one on top of the other. You've got a rudder bar, which is nicely adjustable for depending on how long a legs you've got. It's got some rather nice star wheels which you move with your heels. That adjusts the distance away from the pilot. You've got a secondary pedal which you can put your legs up higher, which is intended so that the pilot can sustain higher G in combat. Theoretically, it should work, and it's the sort of thing one gets these days on aerobatic aeroplanes. That the higher you get the legs and the more reclined you become, is that the more G you can sustain. So it's quite a good idea. It's a bit uncomfortable to use. I've tried it on occasions, and it's slightly unusual position. You've got quite a good control column, in that instead of it being like most aeroplanes where it articulates from the lowest possible point, and you have a 2.5 foot or 3 foot long control column which sort of consumes the whole of the cockpit and is rather ungainly to use. This stick is broken and is perhaps only about 6 or 7 inches long, and it has a chain with which goes round a little gear wheel and down to another gear wheel which rotates a short shaft onto a drum, which then has the aileron cables coming off. So you've got this little tiny short stick with a very short travel. It's geared quite well, so there's you can use it quite energetically without having great big arm movements, and it's relatively light. It would certainly be a lot heavier, I think, had it been designed in a different way, and it allows for quite big people to be in the cockpit and their legs not to be obstructed by the control column. It's a good shaped cockpit. It is actually quite a comfortable cockpit. You sit a little upright, but that's not the end of the world. It's got excellent visibility. It has a very nice adjustable seat, so you can put yourself in the position that you want. It's a pretty friendly cockpit. Everything just about falls to hand. I would have said the worst point of it, and very much an afterthought, is that after takeoff, you've got your right hand on the control column, you've got your left hand on the throttle. You have to open it up, take off in the normal way, and to retract the undercarriage you have to take your hand off the throttle, you have to put your left hand on the control column, you take your right hand off it, put your hand on the undercarriage selector, raise the undercarriage up, check that it's up, put your right hand back on the control column and put your left hand back on the throttle. And there is a little bit of a difference if you're unused to the aeroplane in what your right hand does and what your left hand does. So that's probably the worst feature of all. And some things you have to remember, and one of the checks on a Spitfire is to make 100% sure that you've done the throttle friction lever up. The throttles are usually mechanically or spring loaded to closing rather than opening. So if the throttle friction isn't done up tight enough, you take your left hand off to fly the aeroplane with the control column and put your right hand on the undercarriage selector, and of course the throttle then shuts itself and the aeroplane starts to descend rather rapidly. So it's one of those little intricacies of the Spitfire that you have to get used to, and once having done it, you don't think twice about it. And for me now, I've flown it for long enough not to even think twice about it. It's just a natural action.
The aircraft in which Tony Bianchi has done most of his Spitfire flying is this Mark I.
Yeah, this aircraft, as I understand, was built very late in the war by Westlands. When I say late, it was built post-Battle of Britain, and of course was really non-combat effective because it didn't have cannons. It had only got 8 machine guns. So it was relegated most of the time to training units, and presumably people chased around after it with a weapons instructor flying the aircraft, and they were taught how to dogfight. We've certainly got photographs of it with its red and white cowlings. I don't think has seen many hours flying. At 2 occasions it was commandeered and used as a personal hack for 1 or 2 high-ranking Air Force personnel. It's been belly landed a few times, and it's had repairs done which indicate it's had a fairly hard life, although a short life. It's fairly hard. There are areas on the leading edge of the wing where they've riveted in fairly big pieces which indicate that it's hit trees or something on being belly landed. It's got no battle damage anywhere on it as far as we can see. It's never been restored. As regards originality, well, it's got a slightly later Mark engine in it. Gives a little bit more power. It's got a 4-blade propeller. Air Commodore Wheeler decided that his Hurricane, which he had at the Shuttleworth collection, was probably more important, that it should have a 3-blade propeller. So he removed it off this and found a Mark 9 Spitfire propeller. So this, unfortunately, has got a 4-blade propeller, so it's very unoriginal from that point of view. The exhaust system is different. It should have the Siamese exhaust system instead of separate stubs. It's got later wheels and brakes on it, which are a thing that we did. The very early Mark I brakes are pretty unsatisfactory, and I must say I had quite a lot of frights manoeuvring it around in UK and Europe. We decided that we'd run out of bits and pieces and we should update the brakes. So it's got those on, but they can be changed back very easily. And there are a few other bits and pieces. It hasn't got its correct bulletproof windscreen, but that's easy to change. And the hood on it is slightly different. It should be flat rather than bubble. And all of those things eventually will get done, I'm sure. But other than that, it's completely original. It's got all its gun mounts in. Everything is plumbed, so if you want to get the air up to the guns and make them work, if you want to put guns in it, it'll work. You can go shoot something down with it.
Tony Bianchi takes us through a flight in the Mark I Spitfire, beginning with a spectacular, if unusual, hot start.
Well, this really is a hot start. It's bad enough for me to... Luckily, we've got it going. I look at some very concerned fire crew and mechanics, but the aeroplane's old enough to smoke, so it's running and we're off. Now I'm faced with the next problem. Because it's a hot engine, I need to get out to the holding point for the runway as quick as possible. Although the temperatures now it started stabilising, it doesn't really give me much time to do the pre-takeoff checks. These single radiator early Spitfires really didn't give you much of a chance on the ground, so you need to get organised pretty quick. But we're taxiing into wind and hopefully keeping the temperatures at moderate levels. Unfortunately, I've got a crosswind takeoff from the right, although that's not bad. The Spitfire, even with a narrow track undercarriage, is not actually bad in crosswind takeoffs or landings. We're lined up. Just a quick check round in the cockpit. Check the magnetos. I'm not going to do much of an engine run up as it's warm and the temperatures are climbing. Check the flaps, the air system, plenty of air pressure. Set the trims, throttle friction, put the gun sight off, switch off. We don't really need a gun sight, we're not going to shoot anybody down today. Set the compass. And last but not least, I'm going to set the frequency for a local military field just in case I have an emergency, so they can listen out. I can land there if necessary. Check the controls for free movement. The purpose of this test flight is to check the ailerons and an instrument problem. We made some aileron adjustments and a small undercarriage adjustment. Check the time. I've got 50 gallons of fuel left, so I need to get a move on. Accelerating quickly, full right aileron. Astonishing acceleration with this aircraft. It's coming off the ground at about 85-90 knots, accelerating extremely fast now. Gear is up, and we're going over the boundary about 175 knots. All that in less than 600 yards. Quick bank to the left to clear our noise-sensitive village and climb on up to 2,000 feet and out to the north of the Wickham circuit. Having a careful look around, as we get quite a lot of light aircraft traffic that conflict with high performance aeroplanes. So we've had a look around. We'll now let the aeroplane accelerate a little bit and see if we're all trimmed properly. So coming up to around 220 knots, select the military field on the radio, and we had an airspeed indicator problem, so I want to check that that's working. So tap the instrument a few times, see if the needle falls off. It hasn't. It's trimmed nice and neutral now. We have tightened the aileron cables up, so that's better than it was. So we might as well try a few rolls left and right, or rolling in and out of turns first off to see if it's okay. We now have 240 knots plus 4 boost, and it's feeling pretty good. That's how a Spitfire should feel. So we clear a little further out to the north, check the undercarriage. Lights are still coming up green. We have the undercarriage floating in its locks, so the lights go out. It's a problem we haven't really solved, but it'll be alright for this trip. So a quick check around, make sure everything's okay. No traffic around, and we'll level out and try some rolls. Just pull it up just above the horizon and make a roll to the left. That feels pretty good. Certainly better than it was. Check the undercarriage again. Green lights are back on, so we're sure that's up. Now we've got a good area here, strip owned by some friends, clear of any airspace, no traffic around, no houses, so we'll practice a few aerobatics and get the air test finished off. So we'll aim for running in across their field about 350 knots. That should do nicely. And we go straight up into a half Cuban 8 maneuver, topping off at just under 3,000 feet, down to 45 degrees inverted roll, descending 45 degrees, back across the field, and we'll do that again. Back up to just about 3,000 feet, and we do 2 out of 4 this time. 1, 2 on 45 degrees, back across the field, and we'll brake right, fairly tight, and just have a look around. Now the traffic around, so we'll continue with a few rolls. Just pull the nose up just a little bit above the horizon. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't pause long inverted because with the float type carburettor these early Spitfires have, the engine tends to stop upside down, and it frightens me, it frightens the public, and it doesn't do the aeroplane any good. Of course, on later aircraft they sorted that out, and for brief periods you could fly it inverted. Good rate of roll on this aircraft, and all this is done around 180 to 190 knots, maintaining positive G throughout, and throughout all aerobatics I never use much more than about 4.5 G, except when doing vertical rolls. I probably get up to something in the region of 6 Gs, which is well within the parameters the aircraft was designed for, and was, in terms of what it went through in combat, is probably very gentle. Back across now another field, which is a nice clear of traffic area, not many people around, topping off at 3,600 feet, 45 degrees, down 2 out of 4, and back down to about 600 feet. We'll have another go at that, I think. Back up to 3,500, down to 45 degrees, nice lazy roll, and just check the fuel before we do another roll. That's okay. Now I'm going to clear back to Booker and do a few aerobatics back en route and conclude our test flying with the Mark 1 Spitfire. We'll try a few more rolls just to make sure that we have achieved something with our aileron adjustments. With such a beautiful aeroplane to fly, how could one resist it? These are all done at pretty low speed, about 140, 150 knots, which is pretty much what it says in the pilot's notes for a Mark 1 Spitfire. And in fact, the ailerons are particularly nice at this sort of speed. They're very light and very powerful, and you can actually get the entire aileron on, which is more than can be said for flying at 250 to 300 knots. It's extremely heavy, and you have to be quite strong, and it's not a pleasant aeroplane to roll at these high speeds. It's having a little look around again. We have to be very cautious in our area, just in case a glider emerges at the wrong moment. At least I know that arriving back into Wickham, although the tower is shut, I have one of our engineers on the ground with a radio set, so he can keep a lookout and make sure nothing gets in my way. Topping off at about 3,200 feet. Pulling about 5G. That's more than normal. And on a perfect evening such as this, I can't resist doing just a few more maneuvers. And one more roll. And that concludes its annual test flight. Back overhead Wickham. I'm going to make a low pass across the field, as I have half a dozen eager engineers who have sweated to get this aeroplane out and want to see the results of their work, and I'm delighted to show it to them. So, having made sure the circuit is clear, I'm going to make a low run across the field, about 350 knots, to do a tight brake right, downwind, to hopefully a reasonable landing. Now to get the thing slowed up. Downwind, and as I reduce the power we should get the undercarriage warning horn come on, which will indicate the undercarriage is either in transit, locked up, and it's not, because it's going down, and I have two green lights, flaps going down, about 100 knots, turning finals.
Air Tango's turning finals. Grass.
Going for the grass runway, about 80 knots, and I'm looking for something in the region of 60 to 65 knots over the threshold, and hopefully a reasonable 3-point landing. Not too bad. Now, with these aircraft, you've got to taxi in quickly. It's already 90 degrees.
It is in an absolute class of its own. There's no aircraft in the world, in my opinion, that is quite comparable to the Spitfire, either in looks or behaviour, under all conditions of flight. Now, you can pick out certain aircraft that would perform equally as well as the Spitfire, possibly, under a given sort of configuration and loading. But the Spitfire Didn't matter what you put on it. It was a pilot's aircraft.
Although very much the pilot's aircraft, the Spitfire did have its foibles. The ailerons, especially on the earliest marks, caused problems when rolling.
With the Spitfire, even with the metal ailerons, were still heavy at high speeds. So if you were going to do a very low, slow roll, your speed had to be right, because if you were doing a low roll with a Spitfire and you were coming down over the ground at high speed, you see, not many people, unless they've flown with experience, realise most people think that a roll is like that. Well, in effect, a roll isn't. A roll comes over like that. And it depends how much space that you take, depending on your aircraft, your ability, and a lot of factors. I mean, the first time I experienced this, when my father was taking photographs of me rolling the Active against alongside the Leopard, whilst he was with a passenger taking cine films. And I thought, oh yes, I go inside. But I didn't. I went out of sight of the Leopard. And as I became more experienced, I realised that the art of doing a very tight roll depended on the aerodynamic qualities you gained from the fuselage, and that had to be at the right speed. So that if you came to do a low roll with a Spitfire at too high a speed, you couldn't get the tyres, you had to come over. So you couldn't do a low. When I'm talking about low, I mean talking about the hangar height, that sort of thing. You couldn't. Conversely, if you did it too slowly, not only would you not complete your roll, but you would have no aerodynamic lift from your fuselage, and so it'd be a complete not a failure. So I found that there was a correct speed to do this, and the correct speed was between 300 and 315 miles an hour, which was fairly tight on your ailerons, but you come over, and then you come over like that, with that absolutely targeted ahead, like a rifle. And then when you got over there, you wouldn't continue the roll, you'd neutralise the controls. So that you get top rudder and use the fuselage, the same as you'd use the wings.
Just let the top rudder bring it round.
That's it.
Yeah.
Well, with the metal ailerons, that was all right. But with the fabric ailerons, you had to be very careful, because sometimes they balloon. I wouldn't say they'd be ineffective, but they weren't very good, let's put it that way.
The other major, if explicable, criticism of the Spitfire is the narrow track of its undercarriage. Donald Healy, who flew with Ginger Lacey in the Far East, remembers this.
The only thing that Spitfires had which could have been improved was they had this very narrow undercarriage, because the undercarriage opened up into the wing from inboard, so it was very narrow. And whereas a Hurricane, of course, worked the other way around, and your wheels were about halfway out along the wing, and they're very stable for landing. And they did the same with some of the other Hawker Tempests and things like that, were undercarriages like that. But that was the only thing I could ever suggest that a Spitfire could have been improved. They couldn't have done it because the wing was so thin, and they couldn't have got the undercarriage wheels in and things like that. Everybody had their own particular favourites, you know. And I liked the Mark V. I didn't realise it until I had been flying Mark 14s for quite a time, and I had to take a Mark V back to a maintenance depot. And it was a real pleasure to fly. It was a very nice little aeroplane, you know. You could do very smooth aerobatics in it. It wasn't overpowered. And it was a very nice aeroplane to fly. In fact, if anybody said to me, you can have one, which one would you have? I'd go for a Mark V. We got used to the others, Mark 8s and so on, operationally. Because in Burma, you just had to do. You were using them for air fighting, and you were also using them for ground attack, supporting the army. So it was a good all-rounder, actually, the Mark 8.
Donald Healy's affection for the Mark V and the Mark 8 Spitfire is shared by Paul Day of the BBMF.
For my money, probably the 5, maybe the 8 and the Mark 9 are the variants to fly. So this is in fact a Mark 5, which also has an extensive wartime history. I mean, this particular aeroplane. You can see on the leading edge of the wing that we are now down to 2 machine guns per side, And were we able to see the top of the wing, you would see there's a blister there which actually houses the breech for the cannon. We don't actually keep cannon barrels in the aeroplanes, but there would have been about a 2-foot extension about halfway down the invasion stripes on the wing where the cannon would protrude. So the armament is now uprated to 4 303s and 2 20mm cannon. And of course, as soon as you go to cannon, you go to really extensive hitting power. The front of the aeroplane is not otherwise too different. You'll note that we have gone to a proper 4-bladed propeller because the power output goes up from around about 1100 to just short of 1400. In the canopy area, the armoured glass is now a fitting rather than a bolt-on goodie, as it were. Obviously, we do nothing about the undercarriage arrangement. That stays absolutely standard amongst all Spitfires, and we retain the asymmetric oil cooler on the left and the radiator on the right system, so this aeroplane will still be prone to overheating on the ground if it doesn't get airborne particularly quickly. If we go and look at the tail, you'll see that whilst the rudder area hasn't undergone any significant increase, and therefore it's going to be an ineffective little handful in a crosswind, it has got the extended horn balance which finally sorted out the Spitfire's problems of tucking in high-speed turns. So really we've arrived at what is perhaps the most delightful mark of Spitfire to fly. It's uprated on power, which is a good thing. The handling characteristics inherent in the early elevator have been sorted out, but what we haven't done is added significant amounts of fuel. There has been some upgrade in the armament, which, yes, would make it heavy, but that has now been taken out. So you retain the agility and the light weight of the aeroplane, you increase the power, and so it's a very agile, punchy little package.
Like Paul Day, Donald Healy rates the Mark V as his favourite Spitfire. He explains how the various marks of the aircraft evolved through the war.
Mark V's, which were a beautiful aeroplane to fly. Personally, that was probably one of my best aeroplanes, the ones I like most. And then we got out operational in Burma, and we were using Mark 8s. Well, the Mark 8 was one that had got 2 20mm cannons and 2 Browning .5 machine guns. And in the cockpit, you had a gun button on the stick, which on the spade grip, and you could press the top button, and that gave you machine guns. You could press the bottom button of the same button, it was on a sort of rocker arrangement, that gave you cannon. Or if you press the middle, they got the lot. So if you were doing ground attack or something, you could get rid of quite a lot of ammunition all in one go. And those are Mark 8s. Well, they were built as a really operational aircraft, whereas the Mark 9, although the number was later, was in actual fact used as a Mark 5 with a bigger engine. They brought that out to combat the Focke-Wulf 190s, which gave the Jerrys the shock of their lives when it happened. But as the production was still going strong in Castle Bromwich and places where Alec Henshaw was, and testing at Hamble and places, they kept the Mark 9 production up. That stayed on for quite a lot of aircraft. I think there were about 22,000 built or something like that. It was quite a large number. And then from the 8s, they took the Mark 8 and they stuck a Griffon engine in it and strengthened it up and made it into a Mark 14. And that one came in at the end of the European War. People like Johnny Johnston and that were flying Mark 14s. They were the ones with the big 5-bladed propeller. That was a tricky aeroplane to fly, really a bit overpowered as far as I was concerned, but once you got the hang of it, you were all right. And we took the Mark 14s off an aircraft carrier on a flying takeoff on the zipper operation for Malaya. And we had a 270-foot takeoff run, which was very, very shallow, and 16-knot wind across the deck. That, once we got to Malaya, we were quite glad to see the land again, And how those Navy blokes got on, I shall just never know. I mean, they were doing it day in and day out, but they had my praise for really flying those things. But then the Mark 14s, and then the Mark 19 was the next one we got, which was basically the same as a 14, but just had cameras on it. It was made as a photographic reconnaissance aeroplane, and they had put a bubble canopy on it, a blister type canopy, whereas the Spitfires up to then had got high backs, and you could get a Mark 14 with a high back or with a blister canopy on the top. But basically they were the same aeroplane. And then after that they went on to Mark 21s, and they had contra-rotating props on and did all sorts of things, and 22s, and the last one they made was a 24. But being blunt about it, it didn't really resemble a Spitfire very much longer, you know.
Now this is a 19 and demonstrably a 19. It's got to be a late model simply because we've gone to Griffin engine, which gives you a power output around about 2,100, bearing in mind that the Mark II, which started the Spitfire line effectively, was 1,100. So we've got nearly a doubling of the power output. You can see it's late model in Griffin as well because we've now gone to a 5-bladed propeller. In addition, the coolant problems have in fact increased considerably because we've now gone from 27 litres to 37 litres with the same frontal area, and we've therefore had to go with 2 huge box radiators, which we can take a look at in a minute. Undercarriage arrangement remains the same, but this aeroplane in essence is about 3 to 4 feet longer in the nose than the Merlin variant, which means of course that you can see very little forward in most Spitfires, and in this one you can see next to nothing forward. In addition, it's probably evident that it's got a curved windscreen, which is for purely aerodynamic reasons. It was high-level reconnaissance aeroplane, therefore needed to go fairly fast. It's wonderful to have a curved screen for aerodynamic reasons, but of course it's actually somewhat like looking through the wrong end of a telescope to fly. So you can get in some trouble with the optics of that matter. The wing is very clean. There are no patches on it, there are no blisters on it, there's absolutely nothing. That is simply because it, being reconnaissance, carries no armament, and in consequence all it did carry was cameras which are mounted in the fuselage behind the cockpit. What we've also done with this aeroplane, where the fuel capacity of the Mark II and the Mark V is 85 gallons, on this one you've moved up to 266 gallons. So there is no change in the wing planform, it's still exactly the same. You can imagine that the increase in the size and therefore the weight of the engine, you now add a very heavy propeller, you go at least ×3 on the fuel, if not more. Cameras of the sort of focal length that this thing carried are going to be very heavy. So all in all, you end up with an aeroplane which, whilst you've doubled the power output and you have put the speed from the sort of 350 up into the 450, perhaps even 500 mile an hour range, you've actually done horrendous things to its agility, because agility depends on, if you like, weight over wing area. And the wing areas remain the same. It's got extremely heavy, so the, if you like, the delight to fly factor isn't there. For those like me who are with brute force and ignorance, it's tremendous. It goes ever so fast in a straight line because it's got a lot of poke. But when it comes to actually wheeling and dealing the thing around, it just isn't the pleasure that a baby Spitfire is.
At the end of the day, the Spitfire remains the quintessential pilot's aircraft. No pilot who has ever flown a Spitfire has been left unmoved by it.
Spitfire, you felt you belted it on. You put it on, you didn't get into it. You wore it, actually, which was a very nice feeling.
I think the Spitfire will be run as the only aircraft in the history of aerial warfare that started as a first-line fighter and finished as a first-line fighter. You see, right through the war, I mean, I've spouted this out time and time again. People say, why was the Spitfire so important? Why did it do so well in the Battle of Britain? Why this, why? And I said, well, its performance has been proved. We know what it did. The Hurricane did just as good a job, may have even done better in the Battle of Britain, but that wasn't the point. The point is that if you, and I had a lot of German friends, so I know that to some degree their mentality, I know what they were fearing. They never said, Achtung, Hurricane. It was Christ, Achtung, Spitfire.